Welcome to today's interview. My name is Glenn Diesen. I'm a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. And the guest today, by popular demand, is Colonel Douglas McGregor. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, well, with your extensive military background, in terms of leading armies or war planning or even publications of your books on war strategy, this made you a very important critical source of analysis to understand what's happening on the ground. But I thought before we get into the developments in the Ukrainian war, I wanted to ask you about what's happening in the United States and behind the scenes in Washington, as you're also a very good source of this, because I read your article, The Gathering Storm in the American Conservative, which is a great publication, by the way. And in this, you refer to a crisis in American power. I was wondering if you could explain what this crisis is.
Well, it's an important question, and it deserves a good answer. The problem we've had historically, certainly since the end of the Second World War, is the widespread illusion that our power was limitless, whether it was economic, military, or political influence. America's reach was unending. This, of course, was never true. At the end of the Second World War, we were really the last man standing. Virtually everyone else who had been in the war was severely damaged, and that put us considerably ahead of everyone else. But most Americans don't think in those terms. They simply see this great colossus bestriding the world. The truth is that we're discovering the limits of our capabilities, our resources, and most important, our financial limits. We have this terrible sovereign national debt, which for years people have insisted was meaningless. Oh, debt doesn't matter anymore was one of the favorite phrases, but it's beginning to matter, as it has for 5,000 years. And we face a very difficult situation now, not just with debt, but also the interest rate problem in our efforts to fight inflation. And the higher the interest rates go, the less and less our bonds are worth. And the more money we print, the more we debase our currency. So we're reaching a serious crisis in the financial and economic sense. And in contrast to the distant past, the 1930s, when we came out of the Depression, where we had an enormous scientific industrial base and we could rapidly employ millions of people waiting for jobs, that doesn't exist in the United States as it once did. We've obviously shipped most of our industry out of the country, primarily to China and Mexico, other places. So it's not as though we can rapidly repatriate and put everybody back to work. And then, of course, we have the open borders crisis and the collapse of the rule of law in many of our major cities. Criminality is out of control. And every time someone attempts to enforce the law, it is the police that we attack, not the criminals who are responsible for most of the damage. So you have to view all of those things as the background or backdrop behind the conduct of what's happening in Ukraine. And inside Ukraine, we continue to shovel whatever we can in their direction, but it's quite clear that we've largely exhausted our war stocks. We don't have a great deal more to send in addition to what we've already sent. We can send some new weapons, but again, the numbers of new weapons with new kinds of missiles or rockets are very limited. We don't have huge stocks to back them up. And we now are beginning to get some truth through the American media. Even in the New York Times and the Washington Post, the word is creeping in that the Ukrainians have taken horrific losses. You see all sorts of estimates. Now in the West, people are saying, well, yes, they've had at least 100,000 dead. But truthfully, it's probably closer to 250,000 dead. And we just don't know, but we're beginning to see a lot of evidence that the losses on the Ukrainian side are far, far larger than anything we anticipated. At the same time, we've insisted repeatedly that the Russians were losing, that the Russians were incompetent, that they were stupid, they couldn't do anything. And still in many newspapers and outlets, you hear this business of, well, the Russians are stuck. There's not much more they can do. That too is beginning to break down. People are figuring out the integrated air defenses are exceptionally effective. Hundreds of aircraft have been shot down, 402 fixed-wing aircraft, 256 helicopters, Ukrainian aircraft, that is. So the notion that you're going to send a few F-16s, train a few pilots, isn't going to make any difference to where things are headed. And the Russian military establishment is now larger and more powerful and capable than it has been, certainly in 30 years. So all of the stated goals and objectives, harm Russia, degrade Russia, weaken Russia, all of this has kind of gone by the wayside. And then to cap it off, we have the visit of the Chinese premier to Moscow. And it's very obvious now that the Chinese have cast their lot with the Russians because thanks to all of our belligerent statements and activities in Asia, the Chinese have concluded that they're next on the menu. Under the circumstances, you might as well support the Russians. But we also misinterpret what the Chinese are trying to achieve. We don't seem to understand that what the Chinese want to achieve is this one belt, one road. In other words, they want to build rail lines. They want to move commerce and trade back and forth across Central Asia, through Ukraine, through White Russia, into Europe. And the Europeans, of course, ultimately want to trade with China. The only way to do that is to end the war in Ukraine. And the Chinese are very interested in doing that. And that's one of the reasons they came to meet as well with President Putin. And before the Chinese have managed to do very much, we are instantly refusing any offer that might be on the table for an end to this conflict. And I think at the same time, inside of Europe, certainly in Germany, and I think to a large extent now France and other countries, people are beginning to say, wait a minute, how long does this take? How many more people have to die? What do we do with a state the size of Ukraine that is virtually destroyed? How do we handle it? How do we rebuild it? How do we repatriate millions of people that have left the country? All of these things are coming together, and that is your gathering storm, if you will. And at some point, the storm is going to break out. And I don't think we're going to withstand it very well in the United States because of our own problems.
Well, I noticed the media has changed because, recognizing the losses of Ukraine in the past was, dismissed as being, Russian propaganda. But now, obviously, now it's permitted to point out. But I was curious, given that you have your contacts in Washington, do you see any wider debates or discussions about U.S. interests and policies? Because, again, I'm thinking always back at the 90s when the counter arguments to unipolarity was advanced. There was always, the problem that, you would exhaust America's resources. The infrastructure would weaken, the debt would rise, the soft power would be depleted. And this would happen internally, while externally it would incentivize rivals to collectively balance the United States, which you see, Russia, China, Iran, but even now neutral states and friends of America, such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey, are also diversifying away. So I'm just, and then of course, adding to this with, empire abroad weakens democracy at home. Now there's a lot of political instability as well, with, almost two tribes not liking each other anymore very much. So I'm just curious, it seems like things, aren't going the right direction. So now that you have, because a lot of this predictions seems to have been fulfilled from all this economic cooperation with SCO, BRICS, and at the other side, we're having this huge economic crisis in the West, the financial crisis as well. At some point, people are picking up on the arrows pointing the wrong direction, that these policies aren't in our benefits, the US or the wider West. So I guess my question to you is, do you hear any voices in Washington that are rethinking this grand strategy of unipolarity and rethinking multipolarity, of being the first among equals instead of global primacy?
Well, behind the scenes, and we're talking about inside the Biden administration, there are voices that are arguing for a quote unquote off ramp, or is looking for an exit from this crisis. The problem, of course, is that President Biden and his principal cabinet members, along with large numbers of prominent senators and congressmen, have made very incautious, strident remarks, announcing policies that are extreme, from which you can't easily retreat. How do you retreat from saying that nothing can really end until this man Putin is gone? How do you retreat from our goal is to destroy Russia, or at least harm it so that it, quote unquote, can never repeat what it is doing now? There is still no public discussion inside Washington of the alternative, which is what you've described, that this is unsustainable. It's also unnecessary. And we have no vital strategic interest that compels us to fight in eastern Ukraine. But we are hearing it now from potential Republican candidates for the presidency. Certainly DeSantis, who is seen as someone who could run for president, has made it abundantly clear that he does not support this current policy, that he thinks that we should, in fact, find an exit, that we have other more important issues, particularly here at home, our open borders and criminality and illegal immigration and so forth. President Trump obviously has always taken that position. Whether or not he will ultimately run, I don't know, but currently he's probably the favored candidate on the right. The larger problem politically in the United States is that people have lost faith in the institutions. A lot of people have very little faith in the elections because we've seen so much abuse of election legality. I mean, these absentee ballot things are ridiculous. You can stuff ballot boxes with all sorts of names. There's no way to track anything. If we see this kind of thing, and we're expecting to see it again, one wonders if we can ever have a free and honest election again that could result in any fundamental change in government. That's a very bad thing for American citizens to think, but that's where we are. So that the feelings in Washington, the thinking in Washington is probably more divorced from the broad base of American citizenry now than perhaps at any time in our history. Washington is indeed an island unto itself. People here do not feel the pressure that the downward spiral in the economy is applying to the public. There's no poverty in Washington. People have plenty of everything they want. The people who live in and around Washington are comfortable. The rest of the country is not. And as a result, people tend to look at the world as though this were 1990 or 91. Again, it's back to limitless resources, limitless capabilities. Our military today, in terms of size and in many respects capability, is a shadow of what it was 30 years ago. So the notion that our military can simply push buttons, launch missiles, and crush anyone that doesn't do as we would wish is fundamentally false. And then the other aspect, of course, is this financial system. We now have, as you pointed out, this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, that involves states all over Central Asia, now increasingly Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran. The Emirates are going to join if they haven't already, India, perhaps Southeast Asian states, even states in Latin America, all because they want to get out from under the American-dominated and controlled financial system. Remember, all the major exchanges and transactions across borders have been for decades conducted in dollars. Well, that's been very beneficial to us because we can simply print whatever money we want to, and we pass our debt on to you. Those who don't normally trade in dollars, but have to if they're going to buy the various commodities. Well, this is ending because the Chinese, the Russians, and I think the Indians have collectively decided they'd like to transact interstate commerce in gold. And they have accumulated enough gold to peg their currencies to gold. So we have to stop and consider what this means, de-dollarization, the elimination of the dollar as the go-to currency for the world, not just as a reserve currency, but for the entire world. That leaves the United States, North America, Europe as still very dependent on the dollar, and certainly parts of Latin America and some parts of Africa. But what about the rest of the world? This is a huge development that's only just now beginning to be felt in the West. So all of these things contribute to what I think is the inevitable collapse of support for Ukraine, for this war in Ukraine. It will simply collapse. There's a famous American writer named Henry James. He ultimately left the United States, went back to Great Britain, and became a British citizen. But Henry James wrote a number of novels, and he was very famous for one particular saying: sacred cows are never slain, they simply vanish. And his point was, everyone expects a giant clap of thunder and things to collapse, when in reality, when things don't work anymore, in reality, there's not much noise. People simply walk away from it. And I think increasingly we're going to see people walk away from the United States, its financial system, its global grasp on the global finance, and walk away. It's already begun, and it's going to probably become a stampede over the next year or 2 years.
Yeah, we just add only recently China and Saudi Arabia, well, they issued the first debt in the Chinese currency, which is quite extraordinary considering how pivotal Saudi Arabia is in the role of the petrodollar. So this huge change is happening now, yeah, week by week. So it's yeah, it's quite extraordinary. But we also have the same problems in Europe. Of course, we have our industries are collapsing, and because of energy costs, financial instruments are weakened, and with this, the political influence is also vanishing. But there doesn't seem to be any calls for diplomacy either. Indeed, the International Criminal Court now taking out, the arrest order for Putin. This can only be read as a call for regime change. What else would you say if you want to arrest the leader of a great power? And again, it also prevents negotiation. So it's yeah. So there doesn't seem to be much happening in Europe either. But anyways, I just want to switch gears a bit to.
Well, just before you leave
Yeah.
that, let's just consider the very high probability that you can change governments in Europe far more rapidly than we can change them here. We're caught up in this 4-year presidential cycle, and that means the administration is invulnerable, invincible, until it is ejected from office after 4 years. We're stuck at the moment. Whereas you generally have parliamentary systems that allow for a no confidence vote to occur, governments can change. So potentially over the next several months, you could change direction more easily, and you have ultimately been hit harder economically and financially than we have. I mean, we're headed in the same direction, but let's face it, you're closer to the war zone, and you've suffered more than we have. So I think there's a chance for Europeans to move in new directions sooner than there is in the United States. That's not to say there aren't people here talking about it privately, but no one wants to go public other than the Republican candidates for the presidency.
Yeah, no, this is obviously the protests are going across a lot of big European cities, with Paris now obviously having very violent protests. Although, as to be said, it's largely absent in the media, so it's one wouldn't know. Regarding Ukraine, though, I was curious, how do you interpret the state of the war at the moment? I mean, I do not want to denigrate the Ukrainian army, as they've fought very bravely, but these horrifying losses can hardly be sustained. So I was wondering, where do you see Ukraine at this point, and what do you see Russia being up to next? Or yeah, well, what would you expect happening in the coming weeks?
Well, if you look at any of the film footage coming out of eastern Ukraine, you know that it is an enormous mud pit. And the black earth in Ukraine, which runs perhaps 3 to 5 to 6 meters deep in some places, is simply mud at the moment. If you try to drive anywhere across country off the asphalt roads or hard surface roads, whether you are in a tracked vehicle or wheeled vehicle, it doesn't matter very much. You're going to sink quickly. So in terms of large-scale offensive operations, it would move hundreds of thousands of forces forward against the enemy, which is what the Russians have established and built up in White Russia, around Western Russia, and in southern Ukraine. That's not going to happen until we see the ground dry out. And again, the Russians had plans to do things in January, but the ground simply never froze. You had some areas where there was some freezing, particularly in the north, but you needed a very solid freeze for several weeks. It didn't happen. So what you're seeing in southern Ukraine is the Russians have decided to keep the pressure up along the entire front of about 160 miles. And you have these incremental movements forward. It's light infantry supported by a few platforms with heavy guns and autocannon, large numbers of drones being used to destroy any evidence for Ukrainian air defense, radars, rockets, and so forth, but enormous artillery power. Not just hard shell ammunition from guns, but also lots of rockets and missiles. These things are being used to the point where whenever the Ukrainians move, a formation of, say, brigade size, 2,500, 3,000, 4,000 forward, it's largely destroyed before it reaches the enemy. In other words, before the Ukrainians can close with the oncoming Russian enemy, they're being annihilated. And this is this ISR strike system that the Russians have really perfected at every level, tactical, operational, and strategic, which means that you have platforms in the air, in space, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that are capable of capturing images and pictures and information and radio broadcasts and so forth that occur on the ground, rapidly targeting those things, transmitting that targeting data to artillery and rocket and missile systems, and then destroying the source. This is a terrible situation for the Ukrainians to be in. There's not a great deal they can do about it because the ratio is about 10 to 1 when it comes to these standoff attack systems and artillery. So the Ukrainians, if they continue to push forward, and they still are, in fact, I watched footage of a group of Ukrainians. This was almost a brigade-sized element, and they were moving along roads and across fields on foot, which you have to, or you just sink, and they were annihilated by the Russians. The Russians saw them, identified them, and brought their artillery power to bear. This is also not sustainable. Now, the Ukrainians are continuing to send press gangs, that is, people all over the country, to force young boys, men, older men, particularly over the age of 40, anybody they can find, into vans. They take them, then they get some modicum of training and go to the front. And the rumors coming out of Ukraine says if you're one of those people, you have about a 3 to 4 hour life expectancy on the front lines. This is a disaster. Now, the Ukrainians are spending a lot of money on drones. We're giving them to them as rapidly as we can as compensation, a way to compensate for the lack of power on the ground. But the Russians are shooting these things down. You know, everybody forgets that these unmanned systems, whether they're rotor-driven or they're aircraft of some kind or jet-driven, they can be shot down just like airplanes. And if you have an effective integrated air defense, you're going to be able to do that. So at this point, I don't see any real hope that things will change in Ukraine. And the danger now is in the spring when the Russians finally launch their offensives, assuming there are no negotiations between now and, say, May, and the outlook for that is rather grim, let's face it. Then the Russians will swarm over most of eastern Ukraine pretty rapidly, destroy whatever they find, and then pause at the Dnieper River and decide whether or not they're going to go further. And everything I see tells me that if we do not negotiate with them, we don't come to some sort of agreement on whatever is left of Ukraine regarding its future neutrality and end this nonsense about NATO membership, we're going to end up down the line with hundreds of thousands of Russian troops on the Polish border.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of these videos of the forced draft of these young men just pulled off the street, but this comes at a cost, I would think, because if you have all these people who are forced into the army, now you risk having your defensive lines collapsing, and so it just is this sustainable? How much can you rebuild or keep pumping new men into the army, sending new equipment which they can't really operate? Is the quality degrading as well? Is that why we're seeing this kill ratio of 1 to 10? So that is for 10 Ukrainians for each Russian?
I'm sure that's some of it. Of course, Stalin did this successfully during the Second World War, and he had a much larger manpower pool. But by the end of the war, 50% of the so-called Soviet infantry consisted of non-Europeans, Central Asians that were forced into the Soviet armies. And ultimately, he was helped by the Germans because Adolf Hitler ordered everyone to stand fast and fight for every inch of territory, which effectively is something that Zelensky has done. And that part of the world, ground in and of itself has no real value. You give it up as necessary because it could easily be won back. There's not much out there that is very defensible. And that's another reason why this Bakhmut business has dragged on, because once you lose Bakhmut and you begin to move north and west, you run out of effective defenses. Now, you can build some new lines, but you'll never have the kind of intricate, complex, and effective defenses that you had in the Donbass that you built up over 8 years. So again, I don't see any good news for Ukraine. And my best hope right now is that the Europeans will take this in hand and recognize that the destruction of Ukraine is not in their interest. Recognize that you can negotiate with the Russians, but you're going to have to meet their demands. And their key demand is for neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine. And I've always felt that that was a good solution. I favored that long before there was ever a war, because that places a buffer state between us and the Russians. And that buffer state can actually profit from being a buffer economically in ways that we've seen in Austria, because the Austrian model was always a good model for Ukraine, in my judgment. But that opportunity was lost. But if we persist, things will get worse. The Russians are prepared for the worst. I don't think we and the Europeans are prepared for the worst. I don't think we are prepared to go to war. In fact, I know we aren't. And so if you're not willing to fight, and I don't see any evidence that we and the Europeans are, then I think the other side is going to win. Now, the Poles, of course, are still very vocal. And just last week, there was a statement made that if it turns out that Ukrainians cannot defend themselves and their defense is destroyed, then we Poles will have to move and take the offensive, which I think is extremely dangerous. Again, the longer this lasts, the more the opportunity for stupid actions grows. And we have too many people that are not sufficiently worried about the humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine. They're not sufficiently worried about the loss of human life. And this thing with the ICC that you pointed out, the Russians have found children in the war zone without parents, without family, alone. Yes, they've identified these children. They've moved them to where they could be cared for medically, and they're holding them until their parents can be found, which is a pretty damn difficult task in the middle of a war, as you know. But the notion that the Russians were deliberately corralling children and moving them to some sinister camp in Russia is a lot of nonsense. This is all crap. And what it demonstrates is that all the institutions in the West are essentially tools for the globalists. They no longer represent justice for all. They are basically simply puppet organizations that parrot whatever the globalist regimes that run the West want them to say and do. And this is very unhealthy. I can't imagine this ending well in Europe. It's not going to end well here in the United States.
Well, you mentioned Bakhmut, because I'm seeing now cauldrons taking place, Bakhmut being quite important, being encircled, but over the past few days, suddenly the Russians made some big leaps, encircling Avdiivka as well. This always creates a dilemma for Ukraine, because do they keep pumping manpower in where they get chewed up and have these horrific losses, or do they walk away but then lose strategic territory? So how it begs the question, because if you follow the Western media, Bakhmut was super important, but now that is being lost, it's just it's just symbolic town. It doesn't mean anything. So how do you see this? Is Bakhmut important, and if so, why?
Well, based upon what I know, I have not been to Bakhmut, so I don't know what it looks like on the ground. I only know what I see on the map and what people that are there and have been there tell me. Yes, it does seem to be the keystone in the edifice of defense for the Donbass. And then once it is lost, the road nets, railheads, warehouses, mines, all these things will be permanently in Russian hands. There's no question about that. That's going to harm Ukraine. But right now, the Russians already occupy 90% of the territory that is responsible, or excuse me, the territory which is responsible for 90% of Ukrainian gross national product. So the Ukrainians are already at a severe disadvantage. I don't think it's going to improve when Bakhmut is finally lost. But for the Russians, it has made a lot of sense, to be frank, to leave the road open into Bakhmut. If the Ukrainians are going to pour more troops in there, it is easier now than it was 3 months ago or 6 months ago to destroy them, because they've set up this ISR strike zone. They sometimes call it a fire trap, and it works very, very effectively. I mean, if you can destroy your enemy without closing with him in close combat, that means you take no casualties in most cases. So this is very favorable to the Russian side. And right now, since the Russians cannot rely on numbers and platforms to move forward, this is a very positive development for them militarily, and it will continue. as long as the Ukrainians feed this fire. It's tragic. Again, we need someone to intervene and say, look, this is taking us nowhere. But instead, you talked about the ICC thing. We just had an incident where a couple of B-52s apparently were on exercise in the Baltic. And I'm told that the exercise involved simulating the launch of cruise missiles in the direction of Russia. I mean, this is insanity. Why would you do such a thing in the middle of all this? Doesn't make any sense at all. The Russian fighters came up. We didn't violate Russian airspace per se, but you can fire a cruise missile from a B-52 bomber without flying anywhere near Russia. But this was actually over the Baltic, aimed at St. Petersburg. This is stupid. Just as the MQ-29 that was either shot down or disabled and fell into the Black Sea was trying to gather targeting data from Crimea. Again, what did you expect to happen? What would we do if the Russians did something similar off the coast of Virginia near Norfolk, where we have one of the largest concentrations of American naval power, or San Diego, or Puget Sound, any number of places where we have huge concentrations of naval power? We would have acted in precisely the same way. But this simply is like throwing gasoline on the fire that you should be interested in putting out. That's what's really disturbing.
Yeah, the drone was quite interesting. From what I read, it was 60 kilometers away from Russia's naval base in Sevastopol. Transponders were shut off, and of course, it's there to collect data which can be given to the Ukrainians for targeting. So it's I like how you framed it. What would we do if it was reversed? It's hard to see, us reacting in it differently. I wanted to ask you about this planned offensive, though. This is by the Ukrainians. They arguing that this been dubbed the last chance offensive because many in the West are pinning the hopes on the Ukrainians being able to make some advances. I think it was the Czech president who argued that if this doesn't work, we can't continue funding the army. So again, for good reasons, it's being called the last chance offensive. But how are you reading this? Do you see Ukraine having sufficient manpower, equipment, and ability to use this equipment? I know, again, you don't have a crystal ball, but based on the information you have, what do you see the chances of success being? Sorry.
I think it's very low. The notion that they're going to launch some miraculous offensive involving 1,000 drones and tens of thousands of troops and somehow or another surprise the Russians and break through, I think is unrealistic. And again, the Russians have demonstrated they understand well how to entice the enemy into an attack. Let them press forward, and once they've pressed forward, encircle and destroy them. This is the oldest tactic in the world. This is what the Mongolian armies used against the Europeans in the 13th century. You can go back and look at it, whether it was the Poles, the Hungarians, at the time the Kievan Rus. Again and again, the Mongols would fall back in front of them. They would follow, and only to discover that they were suddenly surrounded on 3 and almost 4 sides, and they were annihilated. I think the Russians would do that again. So no, I don't see really this being helpful at all. And it was the Czech president. And his point was, if this doesn't work, and I'm sure he knows that it won't, it suggests it doesn't make much sense to continue reinforcing failure. And it's not just a question of reinforcing failure, it's inviting more people to die pointlessly. That's the problem. What about the future of Ukraine? Nobody seems to give a damn, as far as I can tell, in the West about that. Now, I hope I'm wrong. I certainly don't see much concern for it here. It's this silly notion, well, we're winning because we're harming Russia. Well, I don't see the harm coming to Russia. I mean, certainly every war harms everyone who goes into it at some point. But right now, Ukraine is largely destroyed. So I wish I had some good news, but no, I don't think it can succeed at this stage. And my great worry is that once the Russians close in on the Dnieper River, and if we do not talk to them, they make the decision to cross the river, that we will be stupid. And we on the ground with the Poles and perhaps some others in the so-called coalition of the willing will try to intervene in Western Ukraine. There are foolish people who think that we can establish a new east-west border along the Dnieper River on the model of East and West Germany, for those in the audience that can remember that. And that's not something that I think Europeans should want. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's counterproductive, and we don't need to go down that road. And if we do, it will harm Europe irreparably.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out where we're going to go, because now it seems that as Ukraine is collapsing, we're at the crossroads. So either we can escalate by joining in on the war, or we can, as you said, the discussions about finding an off-ramp. So that's why I'm a bit confused, because I'm getting signals both ways. On one hand, you're having Victoria Nuland saying, the Ukrainians should attack Crimea, and we will help them to do this. And then you have John Kirby, the National Security Council Strategic Communications Coordinator at the White House, saying, we find any compromise or any ceasefire to be unacceptable. So there doesn't seem to be. They seem to be all for continue the fight, no ceasefire. On the other hand, you're getting these other voices from the president of Czech Republic saying, we'll give Ukraine one more offensive, but after this we have to start cutting back. So this is why I'm confused. Where we're heading on this crossroad, or no decision has been made yet.
I think it's very important for the European leadership to take this in hand, because if they do not, I don't see much readiness at the top of the Biden administration to step forward and say, look, we miscalculated. We did not believe that Russia would come roaring back to life in the way that it has. We thought Russia was weak. We thought Russia could be bullied. We were wrong. You're not going to hear anybody in Washington admit that. And the other thing is the Europeans have to be forthright and honest. Are we going to see hundreds of thousands of Italians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Norwegians, Danes, Dutchmen, Germans, all line up being outfitted and equipped to fight a high-end conventional war in Ukraine against Russia? Is that going to happen? Is there an appetite for that? Is that what these governments want to do? There's no appetite for it inside the United States. I mean, we're having trouble right now recruiting for the armed forces, largely because the armed forces have been demoralized and ruined in recent years, not just by bad decisions on acquisition and organization, but now bad policies regarding transgender and all sorts of equity craziness that essentially destroy the legitimacy of the institution. The armed forces has never been perfect, but it has tried to be a level playing field. And you can't run a military establishment when you are favoring one ethnic group or racial group or sexual preference group over another. This is disastrous. So I don't see anything happening in the United States along those lines. So you tell me, are the Europeans prepared to suit up and go fight in Ukraine, other than the Poles?
Well, my first instinct would be no. I don't think we would want to sacrifice our own. I think the way we speak about fighting Russians, I don't think we would talk in this manner if we were fighting with our own men. I think using Ukrainian men makes it easier. But on the other hand, again, there's never any clear signals. All the mistakes we've done with Russia. And again, I've been arguing for 10 years, if we try to put NATO in Ukraine, there will be war. And I'm also saying if we try to push for secession of Taiwan from China, there will always also be war, but we keep going in that direction as well. There's no critical debate about confronting China, and it's always referred to moral arguments, but at the end of the day, if the consequence will be war, it's unclear why this will be the moral thing to do. But it's there's an absence of a sensible debate, I would argue. But yeah, just as a final question before you have to go, I was wondering, do you think when the Russian offensive come, like you mentioned, they're waiting for the ground to be less muddy, but do you see them putting all their men into the fight? Because wouldn't they need to have a big standing army as a deterrent against NATO? As you mentioned, we might get some ideas of intervening. Surely, they would like to have 200,000-300,000 men standing there just as a warning that they can also, destroy NATO if they want to intervene. Or do you see them throwing everything in?
Well, first of all, you've got a total in and around Ukraine of about 540,000 Russian troops. Beyond that, you have another 200,000 that are in support. So you're over the 700,000 mark. How much of that do you need to be successful in Ukraine is a judgment call that only the high command can make in Moscow. I don't have a feel for that. My suspicion is that given the horrific losses, you will not need all of that force to deal with it. So I would expect that a large portion of the force, it may be the portion that sits in White Russia right now, which is over 100,000. Some people say it's 150,000. That force may be exactly what you've just described. It may be there as the strategic hedge against NATO intervention. You've got another 300 to 400,000 in and around Ukraine in the east of the river. That's probably sufficient to deal with whatever remains of the Ukrainian forces in the spring. Again, we're all shooting in the dark. We don't know with precision, but I suspect you're right. There will be a large reserve on hand to deal with any NATO intervention. And again, that's something that we need to consider carefully because we don't have much depth in our force. You've got 50,000 US troops. How many of that consists of combat troops? How many replacements do we have standing by when it takes casualties? How much fuel? How much ammunition? How many repair parts? And if we're going to fly aircraft in support, how many aircraft are we prepared to lose, not just to integrated air defenses, but also potentially sitting on the ground in airfields across Eastern Europe? I mean, the Russians know where all the airfields are. It's not a secret. It's easy to strike those places. What does that mean for our naval forces in the Adriatic and the Eastern Mediterranean? What does it mean for our naval forces off the coast of Norway in the North Sea? Again, all these questions have to be addressed seriously before any consideration is made to intervene in the region. I hope that that's happening. My suspicion is it is, and I get the impression that the senior military leadership in the United States is more sober-minded than the political leadership and has tried to tell people this cannot continue indefinitely. We've got to come to some sort of arrangement, but no one is yet prepared to listen to that in the White House.
That seems to be the paradox of our time. The diplomats are the biggest war hawks and the military command are calling for diplomacy. But yeah, Colonel Douglas McGregor, thank you very much. I won't take any more of your time. So I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Glenn.
See you.